All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for Vermicomposting, which is our next webinar of the Everyday Environment webinar series. My name is Erin Garrett, and I will be moderating for Peggy today. Like I just said, this webinar is being recorded, so please keep your videos turned off and your microphones muted during the course of this presentation. And this recording will be shared to University of Illinois Extension's YouTube page, usually within 2 to 4 weeks, once it's processed and closed captioned. So after today, we send it up the line, and then we just have to wait and be patient for it to get posted. So we ask for your patience as well as that process is completed. I will share the link to the YouTube page in the chat box. If you want to view any of the other recorded webinars, you can find them all there. And then once the recording does become available, we will be contacting all of you. So we usually get lots of emails asking when if the recording's up. Rest assured, you will get an email from us as soon as we are aware that it has been uploaded. If you do have a question at any time today, please feel free to type it into the chat box, and we'll try to get as many of them answered at the end as we can, depending on how much time we have. So Peggy, I think that is everything on my end, so I'll turn it over and let you get started.
Thank you. And before I disappear, I wanted you to see who was talking to you today. I do work in the northern part of Illinois. I live in Sycamore, and actually today I'm back in my home office. It's a naturalist space, as you can see all my field guides and resources. Um, this program is based on my own interest and want to vermicompost. There is so much material out there, and I'll give you a couple places that I like to go for more information. So this is kind of the overview of vermicomposting and why it's important and why I started it. So I will go through and do my program just through the slides. I've got some new photos. I'm excited. I put more in today because I said I would do vermicomposting again. It like got me, my mom's gonna kill me for that one, made me more interested again in starting my vermicomposting again. I always have worms, but they ebb and flow depending on summer. I compost outside as well. So during the summer, the worms get a little skinny because it's just easier to go dump them outside. So we'll get started and see if we can keep this to our time frame. There we go. And you should be able to see the screen here that says vermicomposting. And I will not have the chat open, but Erin will, if I can get my slides to shift. There we go. So I put this up. It's a quote. I'll show you the book later. I actually took a picture of the cover of the book because I found it quite interesting. And it really is, when we're asked to describe an ocean or a forest or a desert or even, your backyard, you can give this really clear description about what you might find there. And I haven't been to an ocean very often, but I can tell you what it looks like underneath because we were given all that in school and it was this amazing space to study and think about. But when we're asked what is under the ground, we tend to get a little stammered. We are unsure. It becomes clear how little we know about what's under our backyard. And I think we have to pay attention to that. And in the place to start, of course, would be with worms, because worms come to mind because we as children were enamored by worms. They can't hurt you. We're not afraid of them like we would maybe if a bee came at us or something. And so vermicomposting is a very natural way to continue a recycling plan if you have one in your home. So that's where this is going today. So first I had to show you this. If you were listening to Dwayne Friend, he is also on Erin and my team. He talked about composting. He is like the guru of all real composting. So if you have questions about real composting, this is my earth machine. I call him Darth because he looks kind of like Darth Vader's head. And I am not a good composter. Dwayne will tell you that I'm a dump and run. I started composting to reduce how much waste I created. In the in the United States, we produce somewhere around 35 million tons of household waste. 21% of that could be composted. So it's really more of our job. We should be doing this, and it's not inconvenient once you're set up. And I think it's important that we could salvage some of that. And you're going to pay yourself back if you compost, because even if you compost like I do, if you slide that little front door up, It is the most gorgeous black gold you've ever seen. Do I work at it? No. Do I use it? Occasionally I put it on top of my perennials, usually in the spring, but I don't stir it well. I don't aerate it well. It does what it does, but look how it's cockeyed. It's it's being composted because things, natural composters and organisms are coming in and out from the soil, and it's going to sink it. It's clearly sinking it. So I compost. I started composting in Darth here, um, and then realized winter wasn't fun to walk clear out to see Darth. I have to share with you that my son, who's now 24, it was only like 2 years ago. He didn't know that every time I go out there and turn the lid and open it and dump in my organic waste, I say, "I am your mother, Darth," and I put the lid on. And he heard me. He goes, "Really, Mom?" I'm like, "Hey, you don't take it out. You don't get to play." And so that's, he didn't know it was Darth Vader's head, right? So I was doing that, and then I realized how miserable, it is to go out in a foot of snow and nothing's happening in a compost system like mine. It's frozen. So all the microbes went underground. Nothing's happening. I'm just adding a pile to freeze some more. So I looked into vermicomposting, and this has been moons ago, and I love it. And if you can get past worms in your house, they're not running all over the place. And we have this innate understanding and interest. My third graders all get to study worms and learn about how they help. Some old information, I've had it for a long time, and this may have changed. Look at this. So look at the wastefulness, 4 to 5 pounds of waste per day per person versus in Japan. Now this is all the waste. Waste is trash plus garbage together, right? Garbage being food waste, trash being papers and cans and things that aren't organic by nature. So it's a way to recycle, and so if you're recycling and composting, you wouldn't be a part of that 4 to 5 pounds of waste per day. This isn't you personally. This is all of the waste in the nation divided by the human population. It's still a lot. So even if we do our part, it's going to help a little bit. And consumerism, quite frankly, is the biggest thing. Do we really need that cool little gadget made out of something, that was dug up out of the planet for? I don't know. I'm not sure. So when we think about compost, compost happens, but you're going to take money you've spent on food and then put it into a composter or a vermi-composting bin and create new soil and put your money into something you might go to a store and buy in the spring to put on your plants. It creates a natural fertilizer. And I think that you can't, I mean, that just doesn't seem wrong, right? And Charles Darwin had a quote. There was a quote, and he said, "Nobody and nothing can be compared with earthworms in their positive influence on the whole living nature. They create soil and everything that lives in it. If we don't have healthy soil, we don't have healthy plants. If we don't have healthy plants, the bottom of the food chain doesn't exist, and neither do we." So this is important. And it's important for your family's health too, because if you're composting and getting soil that's not, any kind of man-made, it's going to be healthier for you as well. So keep that in mind. So vermicomposting, unlike typical outdoor composting like Dwayne talked about. So when you do outdoor composting, you're worried about carbon nitrogen balance. How much carbon to how much nitrogen? That's a chemical composting situation. Here, we're not so much worried. We're getting a lot of nitrogen and some carbon, which will be the newspaper. We talk about that here in a little bit. But the use of worms and other organisms. Now, you're not buying other organisms, but other organisms are going to come in naturally when we add a little bit of outdoor soil to boost your bin to get it going. And this is a matter of straight consumer decomposition here. So we're not going to worry so much as the green, the carbon and nitrogen balance in this case. We're going to be more worried about water, getting too much or too little water in our bin because it's in a confined space. So vermicomposting. So if you put your compost on the counter like I do, even if it's in a really pretty new compost holder, eventually it starts to get smelly. And if it's snowy outside, you're going to wait a really long time to take it out there only to freeze. If you have a pile like mine, if you have a bigger pile, you might still have some heat in it well into winter, and it may even stay warm in the center through the winter, depending on how big your pile is, your composting pile. But the most important thing, you're reducing your personal waste. You're doing your part. And you're going to conserve water. So if you're not, if you have The garbage disposal. Those were the coolest thing when they came out, but basically it takes a ton of water because you're going to grind stuff up fine enough to wash it down your sink, and it's either going to go into your septic or into the public water treatment plant, and then it has to all be taken back out again or decomposed by bacteria. So the less water you use to do that, and you put your food into composting, that water goes back into soil, which makes your compost hold water. So it becomes like a sponge that if it dries out and you add water, it fluffs back up. And that's really important as well, so that your soil is healthier. It amends the soil. You're going to reduce waste going to the landfill, which is what I started composting and recycling for. My goal when my son was little and not eating so much was one grocery bag a week as a garbage bag. A plastic grocery bag was our garbage bag. And unless we had enough cash to order a pizza, I was able to keep us to that by recycling and composting. So, and if there are some places that pay by quantity. So if you're in a situation where you pay for putting out your trash, oh my gosh, why wouldn't you want to pull all that out of there and save a little money as well? To me, that makes sense. So, and the other thing is, people say, well, it'll go to the landfill and it'll rot there. Most landfills are closed systems. So all the open garbage has a certain amount of days, 2 to 3 usually, that it's allowed to be exposed. So they run it over with these huge crushers. They pack it as tight as can be, like into these really tight spaces, like a cubic yard, maybe a 3 cubic yard, and then they cover it with soil. In order to get aerobic composting to happen with air, you have to have air and sun and water. Well, when you cover it, you immediately take away the sun, and then eventually the moisture runs out, right? And the air is less and less, and there's not enough. And then you get the anaerobic bacteria, and anaerobic bacteria is what causes odor because they pump out methane. So your waste doesn't compost. And when I teach about the landfill to my 5th grade students, anything you put in the landfill in your lifetime, if you've been on the planet since sanitary landfills, lined landfills, which protect our water quality, it's in there. Every candy wrapper that made it there without blowing off the truck, I tell kids that anthropologists of the future are going to know every brand of toilet paper ever made, because those plastic coverings on our toilet paper, every brand is in the landfill. The less we have to put there, the more room there is to put more. So we have to think about that as well. That was a little bit of a soapbox about recycling and composting, I realize. So vermicomposting, it gives you an indoor option in the winter, right? You can actually keep composting. You have to get your worms going. And if you have a larger family, you may have to have more than one bin. I don't, it's just my son and I. So I just have one bin here. I do have 2 bins at my job, at my office, one to feed animals with, bigger worms, and one just to put my lunch scraps in. You're going to make less trips to the cold garbage can in the winter, and you're going to make a soil additive for your houseplants that you can use immediately. It's going to be rich, so you don't just plant plants in it. And who wouldn't want to have a dinner party later in less unusual times and say, oh yeah, let me put that in my worm bin? You wouldn't have to worry about a conversation for the rest of the night. So here's our, so what do we know? So earthworms, they've been around forever. They're everywhere but the coldest and driest conditions. They're hermaphrodites. So every worm is male and female. It's so funny when kids will say, is my worm a girl or a boy? And I just say, yes. They have to exchange sperm. So you have to have 2 worms. Hermaphrodite, unlike an asexual snail, doesn't need that. But the worms need each other. And that clitellum, that band, it looks like a macaroni necklace, that band will form a mucus ring around it. They'll actually go into each other's ring and exchange sperm to fertilize eggs. After they come apart, that mucus membrane, they pull that off over their head because the eggs are laid in there out of the clitellum. So when it comes off their head and dries, it looks like a little tiny lemon, really tiny, but it's like a lemon or football shape. There's 2 to 3 eggs in there that will later hatch. Those, if you have 8 worms today, in 6 months, you'll have 1,500. It's like the bunnies of the underworld. They're amazing because they're all creating cocoons. When Mitch, my son, was a little bit younger and I had the bin at home and I was doing this program, creating my worm bin, I had 2 worms. I talked about it all the time. I've never had seen them in that position where they were exchanging, and they had those clitellums and the rings. I'm like, Mitchell, look at this. They're actually getting ready to lay cocoons. I was all excited. He was like 9 years old, and he looked at me, he goes, Mom, that's wrong. Put them back. He was so disturbed that I was excited about these worms, creating offspring. But it's incredible. We have worms out in the northwest, in the Pacific Northwest, that are 3 feet long. But if you think about the forests that are out there, those gigantuous trees, it would take huge decomposition and huge decomposers to break that stuff down. There's actually an 11-foot worm in Australia. Not interested in that one. And not all worms are decomposers that we can use. We need surface worms. We need worms that will eat in a shallow space. And that's why we use the red wigglers, because they're the most common composting worm, and they're pretty cheap too, which helps, but they're real tolerant of temperature range, cold to near 90, which isn't good for them. It's better if you keep it down into the 70s or less, but they can make it pretty high. They're reddish, they're busy. You can use them for fishing worms if you don't get too attached to them in your worm bin. And so it's pretty exciting to use them. Night crawlers are harder, they need it to be colder, they dig deeper. You can keep red wigglers in a shallow space. So you have an animal who doesn't mind being confined. You just feed it, and it's happy to be there and produces new soil for you. So, I mean, that just doesn't seem like too bad of an idea. The epigeic worms are the ones that are like red wigglers are epigeic. They're the ones that like to be on the surface and eating. So our guy, the Acinia fetida, it always sounds like the beginning of Hakuna Matata to me, so I get singing that sometimes. Clearly, I'm a nerd when it comes to nature and worms. So, how good are worms as composters? Well, they're detrivores. They eat the dead and decaying matter. They eat organic matter, and they change it. And I read somewhere where they actually have they have a calciferous gland. So the calciferous gland adds calcium to your soil, which is created in a type of calcium that your plants can actually uptake and use. And they also did a study in the soil going into the worm along with the organic matter. The soil going in came out as castings. They don't poop. They have castings because it's not dangerous to handle. It's not from meat or anything that would have bacteria, bad bacteria. They actually, when they have waste, the waste actually goes out, and it's 8% higher from this one study, 8% higher in nitrogen. And nitrogen is something we can't just grab. Remember, nitrogen's the magic cycle. You can't just stand outside and keep it. When you breathe and take a deep breath, only 20% of the intake of the air is oxygen. The rest is mostly nitrogen and a few other things. You can't keep it. You have to get it through your food. And so do all the other animals, except for certain bacteria. And then you have to count on plants to do that, and things like lightning to fix that nitrogen for you. All right. So these guys are land's best friend, you guys. And there was a scholar, I read something somewhere, he was a scholar from 1943, who said their direct effect on plant growth is minimal. Well, even Darwin knew how important these guys were. If you don't have worms, you have hard soil. If you have hard soil, you don't have an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. You can't have deep roots. If you don't have roots, you have erosion problems, and the water just runs off the top. You have to have mass aeration. Worms are mass aeration, and they're leaving behind a lot of nutrients, so you can't go wrong. So in case you're in doubt, so this was my bin. Don't do what I do. So my most successful worm bin, was this bin, and it was the worst kept bin. Like, I did not take care of these worms, and they just made castings endlessly. They lived in their castings. I was a horrible owner. That romaine lettuce was starting to grow in there. It was white because of lack of sun, but it was growing. It got up to 61.5 pounds. Do not do that. That's wrong. That is not okay. But I can't imagine the amount of food I put in there to turn it into that 61.5 pounds. And there's a lot of moisture, right? So you're talking about some water content, but you want to be very careful and do what I'm about to tell you to do, not what I did. But sadly, it really was my best bin for quantity. This is that book I was telling you about with that quote at the beginning, The Earth Moved by Amy Stewart. She was on an interview And I got pretty enamored. So I grabbed the book. They did a study in Minnesota because they were noticing in Minnesota around all the lakes that the flora, the plants around the lakes was changing. They weren't invasive species, they were native species, but they were different native species. They couldn't figure out what was going on. And they finally realized and put it together when people were fishing around all the lakes and all these lakes in Minnesota, even though they were sticking those worms with hooks and feeding them to the fish, when they were done, they felt bad for the rest of the worms and were dumping those worms on the ground. And those were bigger night crawlers that didn't naturally live there. And those bigger eaters, those bigger decomposers started eating the leaf litter on the forest floors and on the around these lakes. So by eating the leaf litter and getting more sunshine to the earth, all these seeds from these past native plants could now grow, but the ones who preferred the deep organic matter no longer wanted to grow. So there was a complete flip to the plants that would have been there before, even though they were all native, because the worms ate so much. So that introduction of the European earthworm to the soil actually altered an entire landscape. So given time, quantity makes a difference. So here we are talking about setting up your bin. And there's places out there you can watch to learn. The biggest thing I would say is darkness. Make sure you can keep your bin, or it's a bin that's colored and not clear, to keep the worms busy. They don't like light, so they're not going to eat anything at the edges if it's bright and it's too much light. And our containers that we pick are plastic. Plastics are full of toxins. So in the summer, I usually recommend people fill it with water and put it in the sun and just leach out some of that excess toxin. It's not enough to harm you maybe, but these worms are very sensitive and they're getting their oxygen through their skin and they're absorbing everything. So if you can't do that, which is what I just did, I bought a new bin when I set up to do this program. I just put hot water in it. Don't wash it with soap or anything, but just hot water a few times just to get those, because they're coated, with stuff to help them pop out of the molds too. So you want to clean them a little bit. Bedding with friends for worms to live in. A good shovelful or more, depending on how deep you need, depending on your bin, you want to get some depth going. A deep shovel of good garden soil, preferably a place you have not put any kind of chemicals. I went out to the forest, which has a beautiful humus layer of decomposed leaves, and there's natural little decomposers. You're not only going to have worms, you're going to have good bacteria, and you're going to have little things like springtails. They stay in there. Don't worry, they're not going to come out and get you, but you need those little guys and those microbes to start the breakdown process. That's the breakdown process, is when you see stuff in your compost bin start to get mushy, or it happens in your refrigerator too. You pull out a green pepper and there's a big black gooey spot. Things are breaking down. You want that to start because worms don't have teeth. They can do it. They can work after things get softer, but they can't take a broccoli stem and start munching on it. They don't have that capability. It takes other little organisms to help them. So don't be shocked if you open your worm bin one day and you're like, I just saw something little white thing and then it just jumped and disappeared. You have springtails. Those are good guys. Those are helpers, right? You're going to need some shredded newspaper, and continually, I use newspaper constantly. It helps to keep odors under control if you don't do your bin right, but it also gives them that carbon that they're going to seek to compost. They will eat because it's paper. It's a tree with print on it, right? Air, that's easy, but you do have to drill holes in your box to keep it. You're not giving it so much air for the worms. They need air. You would be hard pressed to seal it too tight for them to get air, but you need airflow so the moisture doesn't get too big. You need an appropriate amount of moisture and food for your new friends. And you want to do that a little bit slowly, and we'll talk about that. And of course, worms. So when you set up a worm bin, the right way to do it, not the way I do it, the right way is like when you set up a fish tank. Whenever you decide you're going to have a fish tank, you get really excited and you're going to go set up your tank, and then you're going to race and get fish, and they're going to say, oh, please don't do that. They're all going to die, because fish create waste. Waste is ammonia. You start to have a higher ammonia and problems in your tank. So you're supposed to put in a couple lesser grade fish. Usually they give you zebra danios, and that way they're eating and wasting. and that waste begins to feed the good bacteria. The good bacteria, you're creating a little biosphere. That's hard because you want fish that day, and it's really hard, but it'll make your fish more likely to survive. The problem is those Danios never die, right? You'll have Danios forever. So just get one or two. They never want to go away. So the same thing in your worm bin, you're going to start your worm bin by setting up your bin, getting a couple good scoops of soil from outside. You're going to put your newspaper, I'll show you that, newspaper on top. And get your moisture level right. You want it like a wrung out sponge, just moist but not wet. You can put a little food in there for those microbes to start, and then order your worms in. Give it like a week or two and just get it settled and going. And then they have friends and they're invited to dinner last, but the dinner's already being served, right? I know this is a lot for a screen, but bear with me. A commercial bin, fancy bins that say we're a vermicomposting, but they cost so much. You can use a Rubbermaid tub. I have an under bed container. Yes, it's clear, but it goes under the bed. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's not your best choice if you're going to keep them out in the open. If you're going to be in a dark basement, no problem. It doesn't matter if it's clear. It should have about a square foot surface per person, but you also need a little bit of depth. That bin that was so successful, that was just for Mitch and I, was perfect. And some people say 18 by 24 inches at the top for a surface, and at least like 12 inches deep for like a family of 3 to 4. Well, that's fine. But what if it's a family that's all vegetarian? So the quantity of food is going to be a lot. So you just have to play with it and kind of come up with what works best for your family. And eventually, if you have to get a second bin, you move some of your worms over and start a second bin. That's not that big of a deal. So you want to, I already talked about filling it with water. You want to drill holes in the bottom. So if you get moisture coming out of the bottom, that means you're going to need something underneath it. I like boot trays. I like to find containers that fit into boot trays. If I'm going to do that, if you have an odd shaped container, you could just put a garbage bag under it, but you have to watch and check it, because if you get too much liquid, you need a place for it to drain. I don't often have that problem. But it is important to have air at the top and holes at the bottom, because top being the sides, I like them on the sides of the top where there's airflow. You just want to make sure you remember it could drain a little bit of compost tea out the bottom. I don't ever get enough to do anything fancy with it with my worms. So the bedding, I always put some newspaper in over the bottom first, because the worms, when you get them, are agitated and they're looking for a way out. So I put newspaper, get it wet, and that covers those holes for just a thin layer, just long enough that the dirt doesn't fall through that I scooped out of the garden. And so the worms don't go, oh, look, an exit, and then dry up, on the ground, on the floor. Because you will possibly lose a few when you first get them, because they want out. They're very, very anxious when they get there. They've been shipped in the mail. So they're a little bit wound up. So add some garden soil in there. And you can also get coconut husk fibers, things like that. But really, it's just a couple scoops of soil. I guess if it's the dead of winter and you need more stuff, you could order some of this compressed shredded coconut, but newspaper. I use a ton of shredded newspaper. All right, so additives, I don't add anything to my bin, but some people may want to. There's usually sand in the soil that you scooped out of the yard. Calcium, if you really feel the need. The boiled eggshells, they say boil them, whether you do or not. It's the whole salmonella thing. But the crushed limestone, there's things, but don't put them on your worms, because your worms are wet and that stuff's all dry. I just try to add a good variety of fruits and vegetables. There's a lot of calcium in broccoli. The stems, I try to chop them up a little bit, because otherwise they stay in there forever. I actually met a woman who food processes her broccoli a little bit for her worm bin. I thought that was pretty cool. Also, the newspaper is your best way to humidify or dehumidify. If your bin starts to get too wet because you ate a whole bunch of melon or fruit, especially like kiwis, and it's getting too wet, you can take out any wet paper off the top and shred in dry paper. The dry paper absorbs moisture. If it's too dry, you soak your paper, wring it out, lay it back over the top. It's a fantastic, that's what I do. I just use my newspaper to humidify and to dehumidify, and it works really well. So there's that bin. Before I just wasn't ready to harvest 61 and a half pounds of castings. So I needed it to dry. It was a little bit moist. So I put in dry newspaper. and watch your cat. Don't leave the lid off because loose newspaper could be thought to be a little bit little bit of a cat box. So you want to be careful. And why these red worms? We talked about this a little bit. They process huge amounts of organic matter. These little red wigglers can eat half their weight in food. Take your weight, we're not talking. Divide yourself in half. That's how much food you could eat a day. Not that you could consume that much, but and they're processing a lot. So they reproduce quickly. They love to be confined. They don't like to go very deep. They're easy to buy. You can buy them online and get bigger amounts. You can buy them at the fishing, any place that sells bait if you wanted to do it. It's way more expensive to get the quantity. I think I spent 30 something dollars for a couple thousand. Again, it's the fish tank thing. I want more and I want it now, right? And because they're worms, I had this little girl came in, the bin was out and I was getting ready to sort it. I just pulled all the newspaper off and I had tucked it just to the side. And she said, "Are there worms in there?" And I said, "Yeah." She goes, "Can I look at them?" I'm like, "Sure." So her and her dad spent about an hour just picking and looking at the worms. So if nothing else, it brought her great joy. That bin, this worm habitat, whatever, it's just a plastic tub. That thing's like $65 back when it was first purchased. You don't need to do that. But you see the aeration holes, the red circles, that's where you want that air across the top. And then there's holes in the bottom of this one. So worm care, snicker, snicker. This is how you're supposed to do it. Best temperature, think about where in your house it could stay 60 to 80 degrees. Be creative. Make it a bench in your mudroom, under a bench, and then have it be part of the bench. There's so many cool things you could do. Dark if it's clear. Moisture levels, we talked about all this. And I notice I don't use a script. I always just keep talking and I end up talking ahead of myself. And if you bury your food scraps, you will very rarely get a fruit fly. Usually if you have a situation that needs troubleshooting, it's something we aren't doing quite right. On that list on our website that Erin posted first in the chat, there is I think it's EPA's. There's a troubleshooting guide there too. So moisture, it's too wet. Too dry, it's not wet enough. You guys can do that. But really fruit flies only show up if you don't bury your food. So you do need to put enough soil in there to get started to tuck food in. And you can't overfeed them. You can't Thanksgiving them the first day. You have to go a little at a time. I tend to go in a corner, bury, go to the next corner, bury, and try to kind of do a clock around my box so that there's food going in different places and just keep going around in a circle so that it's spread out and the worms spread out. What you can't put in there, do not. Food, dairy, and oils are bad, just like it is in your composter, right? Those things can be composted in large mass composting systems, very big. But in your own personal, you want to avoid that. Fruits and vegetables are awesome. Tea bags are awesome, but I do have something to show you about tea bags later. Anything, coffee grounds. I try to take my coffee grounds outside, and even in the winter, I try to put them out there. It's just too much for the worm bin. It's just a lot. So, because I drink coffee every day. So you may want to say, okay, the whole family just ate 3 pounds of oranges. Maybe I'll put a little bit in there, but take the rest out to a big composter. Even if you do something, it's better than nothing. And just nothing in mass. I put that there at the end. And just using the bedding. And if you have a really wet bin and you go to put in a piece of watermelon rind, think twice. Maybe it needs to sit on the counter and dry out. I have a bucket at work where I let like the romaine lettuce stems dry. I just let it get really dry. And then I can use that in an overly wet bin and not over moisturize it. And if you let it dry right away, it's not gonna attract a whole lot of stuff. So this is one thing you may see online and go, "Ooh, I like this can of worms." This is a tricky one to use. I finally, for the first time, have gotten successful with this. This is at our nature center. The idea is, so the top one is empty and then there's a lid. The idea is you start with one above the big bottom part, and there's actually a spigot down there on the right. So if you really did get way too much moisture, you could actually pour off the compost tea. And you could go online and figure out a ratio. You're not going to pour that directly onto a plant. You'd kill it. It's got to be diluted because it's pretty high in nutrients. I've not gotten to the point where I had that much moisture because I'm so careful with my moisture. But the next one up from the deep one on the bottom is beautiful. I'm going to show you a picture of it. It's all castings. The lovely part of this can of worms, it's super expensive. I didn't buy it. It was part of a program that I could, use it for. So the worms, then when you're done feeding them in that bottom one, because it's all castings, you quit feeding them down there and you start basically a second bin in the next one up. So now I'm only feeding them and newspapering them in the next one up. And then the third one up is empty, and then the lid. So the idea is then they will crawl up because they will go to where there's food. If there's any food left in the castings, they're going to stay down there for a while, but then you don't have to hand sort them. You just let them work their way up. So there's the one on the big one in the background is the casting. See how beautiful and smooth and consistent that is? And then this one on the left, where I parted the paper, you can see one of the worms. This one on the left sits on top of that one, and I made sure there's a mound of castings in the middle so they can go straight up into this one on the left, and I only put food up here. So they may eat and go back down, but they're going to have to come back up to get more food. I will not be feeding below anymore. And then you can do that all the way up to 3 and then start over. So it's really, I was so excited when I opened that and saw how they finished off the newspaper below almost totally. It's pretty clean. It looks pretty good. So, all right. Now you're never going to want to be my friend after this. All 130 of you on there. So here's the thing. I wanted to prove that apartment, condo, townhome living could vermicompost. This is an underbed bin. This is an underbed bin, and I would like to share that, yes, that's my space, my slippers, and I didn't even have to put them there. They were still there when I took the picture. That slides under the bed. It's clear, but it's dark under the bed. I have a bed skirt. I can compost upstairs in my house. So if you have an apartment or condo, you don't have a basement. I do personally, but I wanted to show it could be done. And it's flat. It's not very deep, but it's working, right? And I just have myself and my son, remember? And I'm still running stuff out to my main composter and here while I get these guys boosted and going again. So that shuts and slides right under the bed. I don't have to run. I don't have to go to the basement. And if I was in an apartment, I wouldn't have a basement. So this is my little hefty tub that goes under the bed. The thing I don't have done yet is a way to let it drain, but I may not because I watch it really closely. If I get to that point, I may have to come up with maybe a small or like a garbage bag to kind of maybe slide it into a little bit loosely. I don't know yet, but it's pretty cool. And if you look, this was today, I peeled back and I have baby worms already. I have a lot of worms. I did not have those baby worms when I started like a month ago. And so I have all these worms. What are they eating that's so exciting? And if you look on the right, it's a kiwi. Well, a kiwi wouldn't take much work. They didn't have to wait for their friends to work on a kiwi because there's kiwi flesh on the skin, right? And they are just going to town on that kiwi. Now I have to be careful. Kiwis are full of water, but I actually had it was a little dry and I had to be really careful with a flat bin like this not to get it too wet. And so I was using my food scraps as my hydration. I was pretty excited. Now that sticker, the funny thing about worms, when you do this, if you miss a sticker, and I purposely did that because I'm going to wait and see where it ends up, eventually those stickers will literally be on top. They'll kick them out. They have glue on them. Now it may be food safe glue, but they don't eat glue and they don't eat shiny paper with coating on it. Anything that's got a coating, food grade wax that's on peppers and apples, you will, when you dig through your bin and all of a sudden you're like, what is this cellophane? What did we put in here that had cellophane on it and it's crinkly? It's the food grade wax that they don't eat. They can strip an apple down to the food grade wax. You pick it up and cannot figure out what it is. Same as with green peppers or any of the bell peppers. They won't eat it. So it's weird that you'll see it. So I have a picture. So the one on the right, that's kiwi. And they're done with it. I want to know what they put on our kiwis that they don't want to eat it. I don't know if they put some kind of maybe they dip it in something to keep them fresh. I'm not sure. That was today. I want to know. That's my finger behind the kiwi skin. They've eaten everything but the actual outer membrane. And then on the left, that was in that can of worms. You guys, that's a tea bag. It took me forever to figure out what that was. If that's a tea bag, that's not a natural fiber because it's a complete tea bag. They were able to get in it, eat all the herbal tea out of there. They're healthy worms now, and left me a tea bag. So now I know there are some synthetic tea bags that have lately have come up as a concern for people, you know, hot water, plastic, not good. But I want to know what's in my tea bags that look like they're compostable, look like they're just paper. Because if that was paper, it would be gone. So that's something to think about. And that's laying on the castings. And you can see how perfect those castings are. If I took that and sprinkled all my house plants with that for the winter, they would be in great shape. Just sprinkle it on the surface and water it in. All right, when do I sort the bin? Sooner than I do, right? If you want to maintain high maintenance, 2 to 3 months. And I'm going to show you a couple ways or talk about it, how to sort them. Be sure to give them fresh bedding. Medium maintenance, you might go up to 4 months. I say all this, but do as I say, don't do as I do. And if you go longer, you can create a tough environment. Now, I've had worms survive very well in that tough environment, so I'm not going to tell you it won't work, but it depends on all the factors. But if I find when I over care for things, they don't do as well. So we'll see. But you just want to pay attention. And when you get to mostly castings, find a way to kind of separate them up. So here's some ideas. So here's 3 of the options: dump and hand sort. If you have grandchildren, this could take care of a winter afternoon of babysitting, right? You dump them out on a garbage bag that's flat and say, find every worm and cocoon you can and put them in the box, plastic, a coffee can, whatever. Oh my gosh. Or give them each their own and then pay them a penny per worm. Well, that could add up. So be careful. You could do that. Let the worms do the work. So push the vermicompost to one side of the bin, add new bedding, and only feed on the left. You're going to get the majority to move over time. You just can't stir them together, but the worms will move to the new bedding. And you can divide and dump, take out about a third. And then in the spring, if you want to put them out in the garden, just keep some and start over and then spread them on all your plants. That's an option. What I did most recently is I dumped them onto a garbage bag and made a hill out of it. And every day I scraped off the top inch all the way around until I saw worms, put it aside, left the lights on it. They don't like light. They will go way into the middle and stay away, even if there's food on the outside. So you can slowly separate them by just skinning off the top. You can do that with an open bin. Just use a dustpan and leave the light on them. They'll go deeper. Scrape the top off till you see a worm. Set it aside. Let them go deeper. And then you don't have to empty them totally out. You just want to get your bin down to a low level so you can start adding food in again and bedding. Anything to get them to move over without a lot of work is always recommended. And what can you do with your castings? I put mine on my indoor plants and outdoor plants. Some people recommend cooking them. I don't. I'm not afraid of those things, and in the sense of I've never had them eat my plant roots or anything like the springtails and such. In their host area, they're not going to come running around your house. There's no reason to. But at the bottom there, Mother Earth News had said that if you did it at 160 degrees for an hour, not only would there be not a single worm, there'd be nothing left. Except the good stuff, and it wouldn't kill the fertileness of the castings. So yeah, so it's up to you. I just dump it on. Sometimes I scrape it in a little, but most of the time I just pour some over the top, and then I keep watering my plants through the winter. And then in the spring I use my outdoor compost to lower the amount I dumped on there that froze, and take the good stuff out of the bottom and put it on my perennials. I do it so I'm not filling the landfill more than I'm doing it as a food. So this was interesting. What would lives be like if we took earthworms seriously? So it's though we've been pointed in the wrong direction. I love this. Darwin, in his book Vegetable Mold, back before Webster was really available, he spelled it Mould. He and I want to say it's his brother-in-law. It was his brother or his brother-in-law. And he was looking at this shed, and it was sinking like Darth, my outdoor composter. And he goes, what in the heck's going on? Why is it sinking? And that's when he discovered decomposition in the soil and worms. And that's when it all just kind of got started. And this guy, Adam Phillips, rewrote a bunch of stuff on Darwin in 1999. And I found that perfect, especially when Darth was sitting crooked. We really have an opportunity to save our own money on our own property, to be better for the planet, and kind of have something to do in the winter, if you're weird. So I want to share this with you. My mom and I convinced her. She was doing something very special. And she kept asking questions. She goes, I'm going to tell people about this. This was, oh gosh, over a year ago, maybe 2 years now. This is a Darwin garden, and I'm going to start a new fad with all 131 of you. A Darwin garden. This is not stuff that would fit in your composter. This is not stuff that would fit in a vermi-composting bin in your house. These are old trees, old timbers, old pieces of firewood that are punky and would just smoke a lot. And I'm like, wait a minute, we usually burn them up. You guys, when we burn these, we're burning all the chewers, all the shredders, all the big composting organisms like centipedes and millipedes and sow bugs. And we're destroying an entire world that makes soil for us. So I made a triangle out of the first long rotting boards. And I've basically tried to make kind of an artistic little spot in the middle of a pine garden, because under pine trees, it's hard to grow stuff. And I add to this, and it's absolutely beautiful. And it's sinking. It's making new soil, and that new soil is rich. And there are worms in there too. And it's feeding all the elderly lilacs around it and the pine tree. And if I ever wanted good dirt, I could pull some of that out and dig a hole and take whatever's under there, and it would be the finest, richest, herbicide and pesticide free soil I could ever want. And it's all stuff I've either had to physically help cut down, saw up, or land, right? And put there. And I don't want to waste that. So Darwin Gardens, you've heard it here first. Hopefully some of you are laughing. And here's one of them. I tipped it over, and look at all the mud it's creating. Look at those little sow bugs. There were also little springtails, right? All over in there. I was so excited. And there was a huge centipede. I let him go. So real quick, we aren't allowed to promote things. I'm not promoting this, but I would say these are the two sites I use. I actually joined the Urban Worm group online. It's kind of fun. It's like a worm nation. But if you order, here's a couple good sites, but make sure wherever you go, do some research. You don't want to go to somewhere where they're just like, oh, hey, here's some worms, I'll ship them to you. These guys have resources. They have video, they have webinar, they have all the stuff you need. They have food. They actually have a food. Sorry, somebody just came home to my house and they don't realize that I'm online. So be picky and go to a site where you can get a hold of them and answer and get questions answered when you're asking, because I've already gotten some emails from my urban worm company today, and I'm really, really excited. So thank you. That's me again. I'm not in video. And that's Forrest Stump at my nature center in Northern Illinois. And make sure that if you aren't into worms after this, but you're still into cute furry things, Abigail Garfola, one of our professional peers on our team, will be doing all about squirrels next month. Personally, I'm thrilled that I don't have to talk and I get to learn. So you're going to want to join in on that excitement. So I hope I didn't bore you to pieces. Oh, perfect. I did not talk way too long, maybe only for some of you. So I guess, Erin, it looks like we had some things in the chat going on.
Yes, we did.
Thank
you so much, Peggy.
You're welcome.
Wonderful presentation. So we did have some questions. Some of them were asked earlier and you've kind of addressed them, but I'll go through the ones that we haven't answered yet and then circle back to those just for some clarification. So if you do have questions, put them in the chat box now, please. Get those in and then we'll see if we can address them. So there were some questions about the type of bin that you choose. So someone was asking to avoid the toxins in plastics, do you have a suggestion for building a bin out of another material? Or is it kind of plastic?
I don't, but if anybody would ever do that successfully, some boards have toxins, pine has a lot of toxins, and it would be rotting, and I just don't know what that would be. I just think I've always been successful with just cleaning with hot water or sunshine and water, which now is a little late, right? If you started it now. I would say though, if you do start a bin, that you order soon, because they have to ship in the mail. And you don't want them to end up frozen, and they will judge where you are and tell you if you can get them or not, or just plan this year to start one in the spring so it's ready in the fall. Hold on just a moment. I have a loud talking person in my house. My son is speaking in, I think, Portuguese to somebody, and that just always throws me off. Sorry, guys.
That's okay. So another question, someone was asking if you could use flavored coffee grounds and if that makes a difference, like the flavoring on it, if you've heard anything about that.
You know, I think by the time, as long as you're not putting it out there without using it, I think by the time you leach the hot water through it, you've probably taken out a lot of things that, I mean, if you're drinking it and you're okay, I would say the leached grounds would be fine. Um, I had someone ask me one time about paper towels and the concern because all of the items you use that are paper that are white are bleached heavily.
Mm-hmm.
And he was concerned about putting paper towels, not gooey ones, in his compost. I said, well, what do you do with your coffee grounds? He goes, I put all that in the compost. I said, so what color are your coffee filters? He went, oh my gosh. So he was using white coffee filters, drinking the coffee that came through that and was okay. But that's another reason to use the tan ones, you know, something that doesn't have bleach in it. So I said, I think it's fine. You know, it's diluted enough what little bit would be in there for the compost. I sometimes throw up a paper towel in there when and I have one that just had water on it. Instead of shredding a piece of newspaper, I just
Right.
toss it in. You know, I don't put them all in there.
Okay, great. Someone asked about apple and other fruit seeds. Do you throw them in,
Mhm.
um, or do
I throw,
you keep
yeah,
them
I throw the
separate?
apple cores in. I've never found the seeds now that you mention that. I eat a lot of pears, so there's a lot of pear. The pears go quick because they're softer, and I just throw the whole core in there, stem and all. I think the stems probably take a long time. I think the seeds probably take a long time, but I've never, now that you say that, I've come across pumpkin seeds before.
Okay.
They took a while, evidently. I'm not sure what I had that had maybe it was just leftover pumpkin seeds. I don't know. Um, but I've never refound them now that I think about it.
Okay. Someone asked if you have any alternatives to newspaper. You know, we just mentioned the paper towels.
Yeah, you know, I like newspaper because it's easy. I don't get a paper. My neighbor saves them for the nature center and for me.
That's what I was gonna say. I'm like, what if you
Yeah,
don't get a newspaper?
yeah, and you shred it. You can usually find somebody that has leftover newspaper. The key is it's carbon. So because I've never tried something else, you might have to do your own research. But you could check with like Urban Worm Company and what do they use? You have to have some form of carbon. It's a backup system for when they run out of the nitrogen, the food that you're giving them, and it also balances the moisture. I would definitely recommend that whatever you use, it absorbs moisture easy and releases moisture easy, if that makes any sense.
Mhm.
Because I really utilize, and I'm hoping I don't have to drill holes. Last time I did a underbed vermicomposting, I never had to drill holes in it. It just, the aeration was enough. But I was very careful with my newspaper and used it as a control. So if you use something else, like a product you could purchase, I'm trying to think of like wet sweetgrass, you'd have to pay for it, right? So like when you buy sweetgrass for small pocket pets, it smells good. We feed it to our tortoise at the nature center. I get it wet for him. It's easier, I think, you know, for him to get it down. If you got that wet and it dries, it dries by the next day, you might have a natural um, dry, but it's green, right? So I'm not
Mhm.
sure if it's enough carbon. So
So we do have a couple suggestions that people are putting in the chat. Someone
cool.
suggested using brown paper bags shredded instead of newspaper.
Mhm.
Let's see. A question about using shredded paper from your personal shredder.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I use
yeah,
paper from my house. I don't have a shredder. I just tear it up. My personal information, you know, that we still try to like not have out there in the
right.
recycle bin. I throw that in my composter outside. So all that personal information I know is out there and getting processed that way. The brown paper bag might work, but you got to be careful because I've for other purposes, I've used shredded paper bag and it all wadded up and stuck together really hard
Oh,
because the
interesting.
fibers really want to cling together. So just make sure you can fluff it and, you know, shred it enough to fluff it and do a test. Try some shredded paper. Make sure it's not the shiny stuff, you know, make sure maybe it's already been recycled. Make sure the ink is soy ink, you know, not a toxic thing if you're going to put it on your food plants. Yeah, just kind of think it through.
Would paper from the office have bleach, would the bleach be a problem with
Anything
that
white's going to be
possibly?
bleach.
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. We've got
it's a
some,
test. Yeah, test
yeah,
it.
we've got some other people asking about straw or leaves, corn husks, if that could serve that purpose as well, or
Maybe it depends on if you can get it wet and moisturize. My thought on straw is it never goes away. It just and they you're it's supposed to be a food provision as well, right? So think of something that breaks down faster than straw, maybe.
okay.
Good
Um,
ideas though.
let's see. Someone asked if they could put a bin in a heated garage that can sometimes get down to 40 degrees in the middle of winter. Have you experimented with that cold of a temperature?
I have not, but it's not frozen. Um, so what'll happen at 40, they're not going to eat, right? They're going to be alive and waiting, but they might have to wait till it hits 60 before they start moving around again and eating. If they freeze, of course, there's no bringing that back. But they'll keep trying to go to the warmest spot, which if it's a deep enough bin, you might get them to come to the middle. But yeah, I don't know. Unless you could plug in like one of those pet heat pads underneath it, just to keep some heat. But then, because then they're going to go up and eat. They love to eat on the surface. And as long as it's dark, they can eat on the surface. There could be some supplemental heat underneath. But 40 shouldn't kill them, but it definitely will slow them down too much to probably process. And then you might get too much food if you're adding food. Yeah.
Okay. Someone said that they currently have a two bin commercial setup, and the worms are tending to congregate in the bottom, on the bare bottom of the setup, like not in the bin. And she's wondering if there's any idea why they like to party there. There's no food, paper, or nothing. If you would have any suggestions on why they're not following the rules.
Yeah, I would say, I wonder if they're going up and going back down. I would say don't bury the food very deep. Add more, maybe add some more soil. I don't know how deep it is, but start putting food only just under the surface and not putting it too deep. They have to come up to eat. Um, and don't wiggle the bin. Worms don't like to be shifted around at all. So if you're checking and wiggling it too much, they might not like that. I don't know. But it sounds, as long as they're not dying, I don't know. There may be something in there they don't appreciate, like the soil where it came in from. There may be something in the soil that's irritating them that if you added soil from outside at all. Bag soils definitely have stuff in it. They put a lot of, it's hard to find just plain soil anymore that doesn't have, Miracle Grow in it and all these other things. So it sounds like they're just not happy. You could always try to start the bin again with some fresh soil before it freezes outside and find the most organic space you can to dig up that soil so that there's, because they're not going to, if they're not eating, coming up to eat, they're not going to break it down. That kind of defeats having them if they're not doing their job. Um, so test a few things. Mostly you may have to redo whatever soil's in there, not knowing where the soil came from.
Okay. We had a question if you can put nutshells in.
But they won't go anywhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then someone asked if jumping worms are problematic for composting.
I don't know. I'm under the impression that they're hyper composters, but not good at it. They say that the waste from the castings are like coffee grounds. But I don't know what the nutrient level is. I haven't researched that enough. And we definitely want to avoid using them because we want them all to go away.
Right. Okay, someone asked if you, and we'll just do two more questions because we are at 2 o'clock and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But I know Peggy is always happy to answer questions. If you have specific questions, I'm putting that out there. You can email her directly and she'll
Right.
get back to you. So we had someone ask if you have any issues with termites in your Darwin garden.
Not yet. Yeah. I haven't even seen a carpenter ant, which I was kind of thinking I would get my carpenter ants. They're the big movers because I had a apple tree I cut down that looked like it had some big chewers going on inside. I'm like, oh, I'll just give them a new place to move to. It's away from my house. And it doesn't mean they're not there, but I haven't seen any. No, I'm just seeing a lot of centipedes, millipedes, and a lot of sow bugs. And I just realized one day I was about to throw one of those punky things on the fire, and I'm like, whoa, there's a lot of things alive on here, because I didn't want to, sit by a fire that was smoky like that. I love my Darwin garden. I added more to it this year, and it's got moss on it. Things are happening. So something to think. Then I can also use some of that for starter soil eventually. If I dig down and get rid of anything like a termite or something big, I could use that as a starter for my worms. It would have it'd have the good stuff like the forest floor has.
Perfect. Okay. And someone asked if you ever add organic fertilizer to your worm bin.
Nope, they make enough fertilizer for me. I don't add anything to them.
All right. Well, seeing as we are just past 2, we will go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, everyone, for the great questions and the great discussion. Everyone was jumping in there faster than Peggy could talk to give suggestions. So thank you for that. And Peggy, it's always great to be on with you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge today. And we look forward to what you do next.
And thank you, Erin, for being my bestest co-host help.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.